Hey there, interwebs. So I don't know, wrestled with or experienced insomnia at different times throughout my life. And it's reared its head a little bit these last couple of weeks. Couldn't sleep. And instead of tossing and turning and keeping my boyfriend awake, I was going to get up and do something else. And then this question that somebody asked me recently just kept percolating through my mind and couldn't, it's like felt like a little bit like a dog with a bone. So here I am. It's 3:03 a.m. where I am. It's a very odd time for me to be on Facebook Live, but welcome to those of you who are either insomniacs with me or in some other part of the world where this is not insomnia time, or perhaps you're just total night owls, early morning birds, or watching the replay. So, welcome wherever you are. And I hope you enjoy my insomniac musings. So, there were two things that came up that somehow connected for me. And I'm not exactly sure. I don't have a direct linear line how they connect, but something about them feels really connected. I'm going to see if I can find it here. But somebody asked me, what is something you would never compromise on and why? I wanted to get the wording because I've been really like chewing on this idea of compromise. And I couldn't come up with a single thing. And at first I guess I was sort of judging myself for that. I was like, well, that doesn't seem right, like that sounds like, you should take a firmer stand. Like if you're willing to compromise on anything, like who the hell are you? Um, but I've just been like chewing on it, this idea of what is something I would never be willing to compromise on and why. And I would come to I'm really curious too for any of you, like what comes up when you hear that question. And maybe some of you have something really, really clear and you're just like, yeah, and maybe it'll spark, and I'll be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But everything that would come up for me, I was like, there's just gotta be something that I wouldn't compromise on, or there's gotta be like but I would, it come up with something like, well, my values. And maybe that's true. But again, like as an actual response to me, that seems kind of like a cop out because, then it comes down to, well, what are your values, right? Like to actually choose like a tangible thing, what's something I would never compromise on. So then I was sitting with like, well, what are my values? Honesty. What I'll compromise. I have compromised honesty and I will probably do it again. And honestly, I think I've compromised around honesty in ways that actually feel very in aligned or in integrity, and been definitely ways that have been out of alignment as well. So values, honesty, telling the truth, like those. But I'm like, if I actually use the example of a particular value, I'm like, well, I don't hold some hard stop there. My beliefs. Was another value I came up with. And even things that really matter to me, I was sort of I was thinking like, okay, something I would never compromise on, like, well, the earth, like my love for the earth or my care for the earth. And I was like, yeah, but I compromise on that every day. Every day, well, probably still every day, but it's like I used to drive the kids to school even though we could walk there in 15 minutes, like total compromise on something that I deeply, deeply value. Um, there's lots of ways I don't compromise. There's lots of ways I go out of my way to really like honor my values. But if I come down to something, I'm just like, I will, and I do. Um, what's another one? So then I was thinking like my integrity, right? Like I'll never compromise on my integrity or my truth. But again, to me, those are like my truth, especially, is something that's so shifting, not like flighty, like it's just shifting, like, oh, this is true, like, oh, this is true. But like, there's not something where I'm like, this is true. And that's just the way it is forever and ever. Amen. And so to say I would never compromise on my truth just also doesn't seem true, in the sense that, and I know this is different than compromise, but this is where these two things get related for me, is that, my truth or the truth or what I believe in. Um, as far as I can tell, like I have consistently always been open. I hope I continue to be open in my life to that changing based on new, I like to say based on new data, which always just sounds like content information, but I mean new data, like new sensation, new input from other people, what we consider actual scientific data, or new intuition, or new, so just like all of the data available, like I'm like, and and integrity was the same way, like, "Oh, I'll never compromise on my integrity." Like, again, it was kinda like the earth. I was like, "Well, but I do all the time." I think most of us, if we're really honest, there's, many, many tiny and not so tiny ways that we compromise on our integrity. So I've been just struggling with this idea. What is something I would never compromise on, and why? And ultimately not being able to come down to something in particular. And so something else, this was this other piece that somehow seems related to me. And had really interesting conversation with my boyfriend about this today, because I asked him. So I had a friend who was sharing with me these dramatic life changes for her. She's like, and then I did this, and then I like completely turned my life around. And or like, she changed her mind about everything, and like completely shifted from like this whole profession to this whole profession, or this whole belief to this whole belief. And I've known other people like this. I've definitely heard this. And I also remember about, I don't know, a long time ago now, being on a date with this man, and he described to me like being raised pretty conservative, Republican, Christian, just seeing things from a certain worldview. And and then somebody gave him The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And he said it was like this, it wasn't everything didn't just change in that moment, but reading that book was like the crack in everything, and he changed his worldview completely. And I remember looking at him and just thinking, that is so brave. And I remember that being a moment. So this was probably, my son's gonna be 11. It was probably about 10 years ago. And I started even in that moment to go like, have I ever changed my mind that dramatically? Because it just seemed so brave. And I really thought like, I don't know if I ever have. And it was the same thing recently. A friend was talking about this, and I said to her, I said, I don't know that I've ever like, deeply, deeply changed my mind about something that I truly believe in, or that's like, um, but what became more clear in my conversation with my boyfriend today about this, because I asked him, because I was really, again, I was like having this thing of what is something I would never compromise on, and why, and not being able to come up with anything, and kind of being like, what does this mean about me? And then it just kept linking up to this idea of that I don't feel like I've ever just like totally changed who I am, or totally changed my life, or totally. And it's not that I mean, I left college and I went to a monastery, like I quit my corporate job, I became a nanny, I started a training and a coaching business. Like there have been dramatic, what could be seen as dramatic changes in my life. My ex-husband and I divorced. I moved to a different city. I had there have been, it's not like there haven't been big things in my life or changes. But what came up in my conversation with my boyfriend today, I asked him, I was like, have you ever like really changed your mind about something you believe in? And and he was kind of coming to the same thing, like came up with a couple things. He was raised pretty Christian. And he's like, but then there was just a point I was like, not really for me anymore. I was like, but do you remember it being dramatic for you or for your family? And he was like, no. And what he was saying that resonates with me is that, like, I don't know that I've ever. I mean, the thing is, I do have strong opinions. Like, I do have strong beliefs, but I don't know if I've ever like held a belief so tightly that I wasn't ever kind of already looking for all the other perspectives, not to try to poke holes in it or like see if it was true or, like I don't know if I really believe that. I'd be like, I totally believe it, but like there's some part of me that's always a little bit looking at like, what is it like to be a person who believes differently? And I mean, it may be like that I'm like, maybe that's how I was raised. Maybe it comes from being raised in a Buddhist community, and so there's sort of always this idea of like the middle way. Or I've really my whole life sort of had this like yes and, which is a kind of a whole coaching technique and a philosophy in and of itself. But I've just always seen the world that way, even when and even though I have also pretty much all my life been pretty passionate and like I'll argue things and all, but I'm just always willing to be like, oh, well, that's new information. Like, okay, now we're going to argue really passionately this way, but they're not like these huge pieces. I kind of went through this phase. I remember this is what I was telling my friend because I was trying to come up with like some really big thing that I truly changed my mind about. And I was like, well, I went through this phase where I claimed I was an atheist, but I don't think that was ever really true. I think I was kind of just like a teenager and attempting to, I don't know, be dark and moody, atheistic. I think I always, had that sense in some sort of awe and wonder in the world. And then I was raised Buddhist. When I was 9 years old, I spent a summer in Richmond, Virginia, with my aunt and my grandmother on my mother's side. And we went to church every Sunday. They're very, very religious. I went to Sunday school and just the whole 9 yards, like Christian camp. And I loved it, totally loved it. But it wasn't like I was like, I'm not a Buddhist now, I'm a Christian. I was just like, this is fantastic. Let's do it all. And I went home and I asked my mom if we could go to church. And to her credit, she said yes. And we started going to church. But we never we didn't stop being Buddhist. So as I talk this out, I'm like, maybe this comes from my mother. Like there's a way that she was able to kind of hold that in her life. Anyway, again, whether you're here live or you're watching the replay, I'm really curious about both of these for other people. What is something that you would never compromise on and why? And can you remember something where you really dramatically or in a big way changed your mind about like a some closely held belief or some. I mean, one of the things my boyfriend said was, he was like, well, beer. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, I tried it when I was young and I thought it was horrible. And then later I tried it and I liked it. And I was like, no, that's just your taste buds. That's not like it's changing a belief about something. Like I didn't like Brussels sprouts and now I like Brussels sprouts, but like, it's not really, like fundamentally a belief. And even that kind of like changing my life, there's a way in which it was like when I tell the story, and even when I look back on it, in a way, it's kind of dramatic. When I was going to college at UC Santa Cruz, and I really hit this low point, and I left, and that's when I went. It was for me, it was what felt like going home. I went back to the Buddhist monastery where I was raised, and I ended up then living as a young adult in the monastery for 3 years ish, and so one could see that as kind of a dramatic life change, but there's also a way it just wasn't. It was like I just made this choice, and then I just made this. Like it didn't really change anything about me or my worldview or where I was headed in the world, or um, and And so there's a little bit this way I talked about at the beginning of this, this almost judgment of myself as I would go, is there, what would I never compromise on and why? And not really being able to come up with anything. Like what does that mean about me? Does that mean I don't stand for anything? Does that um but then there's also this way as I've percolated on this and then kind of talking it out and looking at the way that it goes with changing my mind or not changing my mind is like there's something I also really like about myself, which is not about being wishy-washy or not being willing to like take a stand, but that there's I like about myself this desire to explore different perspectives or to I think I've always been curious. And so that tend that has had me tend to not be so reified in either my life decisions or my beliefs or my um, my orientation towards the world in a way where then changes or shifts aren't so dramatic. It's not like I believed this and it was true, and then I believed this and that was no longer true, and this was true. I've just always been kind of curious about like, well, how does this work, and how does this fit, and can this also fit too? And I don't really see why I can't be Buddhist and Christian, and and that has just been a part of my life, and I really like that about myself. And I do think that that's made me a like, it's part of what allows me to work with people in the way that I do because I'm so curious about life and I'm curious about people. And when they're different from me, I'm just like, that's so cool. Like, that's so different than how I see it, or I'm so curious. But in conclusion, if you will, of this, my insomniac rambling Facebook Live, the one thing that I have landed on around what would I never compromise on and why. Again, I have compromised. It's like, or I act in ways that are not around this. But the one thing that I've been able to land on that I can't quite poke holes on has something to do with kindness. And then actually, just while I was talking, a piece came up around justice. I don't think is quite the right word, but there's something in that. And to me, those two are actually quite related. And so, but the way that that could manifest, or there's something about those two aspects. Again, the word justice isn't quite landing for me, but it's something like that. It's in the domain. I'll have to look at maybe one of you can think of a synonym. But what are these other words? And then kindness. I wrote something about this sometime in the last couple of years about there was a woman in the town where I grew up who used to make these beautiful calligraphy art calendars every year. And it sort of became a tradition where my mom would give me one every year. I always sort of knew I was going to get one. I could always see the package. And I was like, that's my calendar. And I loved it. I totally loved these calendars as a kid. And they were just beautiful. And they had beautiful quotes. And one of the quotes was something about like, there are three important things in life. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. The third is to be kind. And it really stayed with me. I probably actually still have like that calligraphy from that calendar somewhere in some box, clipped somewhere. And while I can't say that I have 100% always been kind in my life, I think that is something that I continue to make the gesture towards. And that, you know, given the option, I guess, is not one of those places where I would compromise, like, well, it's okay to just fuck someone over, or like, well, it's okay to and there is it's interesting. So anyway, I appreciate the space here and your attention in which to spiral around this and sort of also come to this place where I see that like at this deep level where kindness and something around justice are deeply intertwined. So, again, I would be very curious to hear your responses. What is something you would never compromise on and why? So, I guess I haven't answered the question why. And then also this idea around changing your mind. Gosh, why is a great question. I love the things where it comes down to something I'm like, because it's just right. Like that's my response. Like because I remember when I was when I left the monastery and I was about 20, maybe I was 22, and my boyfriend at the time, I had met him in the monastery, but I moved to San Francisco to be with him, and I was living with him, and he was teaching meditation classes out of our living room. And there, we had another housemate as well, and she was coming to the meditation classes. And I remember her asking, at some point, there was like this question around, like, but why should I sit with discomfort? And at the time, I was just like, I don't even know how to answer that question. Like, it's just it was it was such a fundamental part of my worldview that there's value in sitting still with discomfort that I couldn't even really give it like a good answer. Like, well, why? I'm like, just because that's a good thing to do. Builds character, like Calvin's dad would say in Calvin and Hobbes. Um, so kindness, why? There's something to me about our humanity. Although it's interesting, I don't think that it's only a human trait. So I'm not sure why I use the word humanity, but I think we lose something of what it is to be human. It's not just animal. I don't know that all animals have, but there's like a certain, there's something, but I do think that some other animals, some other beings, some of the more than human realm, also expresses something in the realm of kindness that's connected, but I can't quite catch that one. So, not compromising and why that what it comes down to in some ways, like I don't know if there's a point to being alive as a human if we're not gesturing towards kindness, towards ourselves, with each other, towards the more than human realm, to the world, like just gesturing kindness. And there's something I really love about that word because it's so different than niceness, or even love. There's some fundamental point that to me that gives like our lifing on earth. It's connected to generosity, and I guess the place for me, without necessarily linking this to particular politics, if you will, though I have strong feelings about politics, strong beliefs, strong opinions. Mm, and because I was talking about kindness, and then whatever this bridge or link is with what might be called justice or some better word than that, but related to that is, I guess I believe that if we truly come from kindness, because one of the other ones that came up for me was compassion. Earlier, when I was just like, it's like, would I not compromise on compassion? I was like, what does that mean? Um, didn't it just couldn't quite land. I believe that if we're truly able and willing, and this actually goes with the piece around changing my mind or not changing my like the curiosity, like if we're truly able and willing to be curious about other people and to see from their perspective and sort of gesture in kindness, that I don't think that we can truly, without lying to ourselves, um, not gesture towards what could be called justice, or equity, not equality exactly, but equity. And I don't know that that's true. I mean, certainly there's many, many people in the world who seem to believe and who act differently than that. But I don't understand it. I don't understand. And I guess this is a judgment and a projection, right? That it strikes me that people have to block off some caring about others or some gesture of kindness or some being able to see another perspective than just like mine or my family or the people who look like me, or block off in some way and really lie to one's own self in order to not care about that. Um, Thank you for listening. Thank you for being with me. For those of you who this might also be insomnia, I hope that you find relief. I'm having a cup of Tulsi rose tea and California poppy infused water. I'm going to go read my book and see if I can sleep for another few hours. For those of you who this is the time you wake up, more power to you. Or if you're somewhere on the other side of the world and this is actual daytime for you, I hope it's beautiful. I hope it's a beautiful day wherever you are.